Sisters and brothers and comrades, this is an introduction that I did to a Zoom conference hosted by the Workers' International Network on Covid-19, the rise of new zoonotic diseases, and the capitalist disaster. In today's New York Times, the bard of neoliberalism, Thomas Friedman, wrote about how Trump cannot defeat Mother Nature, which, as he explained, is entirely made up of chemistry, biology, and physics. And in his own half-hearted and semi-conscious way, Friedman is reminding us of what Frederick Engels wrote. He wrote, quote, "We by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing outside nature, but we, with flesh, blood, and brain, belong to nature and exist in its midst." Over the last 15 years or so, we saw developing in a general way the clash between capitalist development and the laws of nature, of the natural world, through the development of global climate change. But people could in the main only feel that impact gradually and indirectly. At the same time, what was developing under the skin, so to speak, was the rise of new zoonotic diseases. That term, zoonotic disease, meaning one that jumps the barrier from another species to humans, is a new one for me and will be new for most workers, but I think it should be commonplace in the working class. And it's true that most infectious human diseases are zoonotic, but in recent decades, the process of zoonoses has been vastly accelerated and intensified. We are seeing the opening of a new era in world history, and a crisis based on this new era. And if we, meaning the working class and socialists within the working class, if we don't understand the nature of this new era, we will not be equipped to deal with it. And the dawn of the last century also saw the rise of a new era. That was the era of the crisis of imperialist world domination, a domination that still exists to this day. In that situation, the working class was caught unprepared, as was the socialist movement within the working class. And the working class was punished for this by the resulting 2 world wars and the rise of fascism. Now, though, the nature of this crisis differs from all other crises under capitalism. Unlike economic and political crises, which arise from the laws of motion of capitalism itself, this crisis arises from the clash between capitalist development and the laws of nature, the natural world. And if we don't start from that basis, if we only deal with the inequities, the injustices, and even the immediate struggles of workers under this crisis, as important as all of that is, then we are only dealing with the effect, not the cause, with the symptoms, not the disease. Rob Wallace, in his important book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, castigates the scientists for only dealing with the science behind zoonoses. He explains that we cannot understand Ebola, for example, without understanding not only the changes in land use that drove it forward, but also which economic and political players were behind those changes. In other words, it's impossible to really understand the disease without understanding the political forces that opened the door to its rise. This is exactly the failing of most scientists. But socialists often have the mirror image of that failing. They all too often only deal with the politics and the economics without dealing with the science. In other words, the scientists deal with the science but not the politics and economics, and most socialists deal with the politics and economics but not the science. Neither is capable of really understanding or explaining the issue, and therefore is incapable of proposing long-term solutions. Now, Wallace is trained in studying how viruses and other pathogens and germs evolve, how they change. But this approach differs from most of his peers in that he says that scientists can get bogged down in a blizzard of details and lose track of the greater context. What were the conditions under which the virus, for example, evolved in this particular way? What's necessary is to see the circumstances in which such a virus is not only likely to develop, but in which such a development is inevitable over the longer term. That is important because, as he explains, once a new pathogen, for example SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, once a new pathogen is discovered, it's already too late. The virus is already out there in the environment. It's closing the barn door after the horses have escaped, so to speak. Now, in order to understand COVID-19, we have to place it in the context of the rise of a whole series of new zoonotic diseases: SARS, MERS, swine flu, aviary flu, and a whole host of others. And there are two conditions that have opened the door to regular zoonoses. On the one hand, we have wild habitat destruction, which is usually due to land development for megatourism, logging, or agriculture factory farming development. This disturbs the wild species, often forcing them to come in closer contact with both humans and also domesticated animals. In addition, we have the rise of factory farming. This means raising meat animals packed cheek by jowl, hundreds, maybe thousands, all packed in together. Not only are they packed in together, they are also genetically nearly identical, so that once a pathogen, often a virus, can get a foothold in one of these animals, it can spread like wildfire. The whole process is accelerated by the fact that the animals are slaughtered at an ever earlier age. So that puts pressure on the virus to evolve in such a way as to be able to be passed on ever more easily. In other words, to be ever more easily transmitted. Now, maybe the great majority of virus mutations do nothing. Maybe the great majority can't be transmitted between the animals or from another species to humans. And maybe they do little or no harm to the host. It doesn't matter if it's only 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000,000 that can be passed on and does do harm. In this situation, it's like a forest dried out by a years-long drought, and where there are no fire breaks in the forest, and in a region where there are regular lightning storms. Sooner or later, one lightning strike will set off a conflagration. Now, one detail. 2 species are often mentioned in this dynamic: bats and hogs. The reason is that bats and therefore are hosts to an unusually large number of viruses. And as far as hogs, the reason they are often involved is that apparently their immune system is similar to humans, so a virus that can overcome their immune system is likely to be able to overcome ours. An example of this process was a renewed outbreak of Ebola a couple of years ago in Guinea. There, several companies, including a British-backed one called Farmland of Guinea Limited, obtained 99-year leases on, quote, underused agricultural land, as the World Bank calls wild habitat in Africa, among other things for the purpose of growing palm oil trees. Also, factory farms were set up in the region. This disturbed the natural roosting place of fruit bats, which started to settle in the areas around humans and also around the factory farms. And the hogs picked up and ate the fruit that the bats dropped, together with the saliva from the bats, which contained a virus that evolved into the Mekona strain of Ebola virus. And Wallace gives one example after another. For example, there was a swine flu outbreak of the 1990s, renamed H1N1 outbreak because the hog industry objected to the original name. Wallace explained that it was passed back and forth from birds to hogs, so in one sense, it should be called the swine bird flu. However, it would be more accurate to call it the NAFTA flu, as Wallace does. He explains that NAFTA drove the small hog farmers out of business in Mexico, and the large factory farms, first and foremost Smithfield farms, took over. Incidentally, part of the reason that these factory farms outcompete the small farmers is due to the U.S. government support of these farms. Anyway, Wallace gives the evidence that a virus evolved among hogs and factory farms around Veracruz that was able to jump the species barrier to humans. Those working around the hogs, cleaning up their shit and caring for them, and it was then passed on from one human to another. There are a few scientists who have studied and explained the role of habitat destruction in the rise of these new zoonotic diseases. But one of the things that distinguishes Wallace is that he's the only one who names the companies and the individuals that are driving the process. As a result of the failure of others to do this, other scientists and scientific writers end up, in effect, blaming the victims. Oh, it's these people in Africa or in Indonesia who are encroaching on wild land is the implication. Now, in the case of the virus that causes COVID-19, Wallace's view seems to be evolving. This is a new virus, and it takes a lot of detective work to figure out where and how this virus evolved. A few weeks back, he seemed to be saying that the virus seemed to have evolved in the wet markets in Hunan. But more recently, he seems to be saying that a region in Guangdong province, some distance from Hunan, was where it might have originally evolved, or anyway, that was a location where part of that evolution occurred. In any case, the fact that it has genetic material from different animals makes it highly unlikely that this was developed in a lab and escaped either by accident or intentionally, either in China, as Trump claims here, or here in the U.S., as the lunatic conspiracy theorist Judy Mikovits claims. Now, there are dozens of other examples, as well as other aspects of the science involved, that really need discussing, and I hope we do discuss them in the future. But for reasons of time, I want to pass on to other political aspects, starting with the response of the capitalist class and their strategists. On the one side, we have the more insane wing, as represented here in the U.S. by Trump and the Wall Street Journal. Their view is to open up everything and allow the disease to rip through society unchecked, after which we will have acquired herd immunity, meaning that enough people will have had the disease and be immune so that it won't really spread easily. We see the disastrous effects of this in, for example, Guayaquil, Ecuador, where there have been so many deaths that people were simply dumping the bodies of their loved ones out on the street, where they piled up like so much uncollected garbage. Completely aside from the massive suffering, though, there is no guarantee that herd immunity is even possible. That's because we don't know if once a person has had the disease, they become immune, and if they do, for how long they are immune. We also need to take a closer look at the representatives of the more sane wing of the capitalist class. Here in the U.S., they are best represented by Anthony Fauci and the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo. He's on TV every morning with his press briefings, and he's an extremely talented and intelligent capitalist politician. And his talent lies in the fact that he's actually able to make statistics interesting. And he stands in stark contrast to Trump, who bases himself on emotions and lies and appeals to the worst in people. But Cuomo, too, has a fundamental weakness, and it's the same weakness that FDR had. FDR's reforms were incapable of ending capitalism's most serious economic crisis to date. It took an immense human disaster, the rise of fascism in World War II, to accomplish that. Similarly, Cuomo, Fauci, and the wing of the capitalist strategists that they represent want to lessen the impact of COVID-19, but they totally obscure the cause, which is capitalism's clash with its looting of nature through factory farming and habitat destruction. In essence, what Cuomo and his wing represent is a school of thought known as eco-modernism. That is the view that all society's problems can be resolved by ever more modern technology, everything from the most modern light bulbs to nuclear energy. In the case of COVID-19, all that's needed is better social distancing, wearing masks, and vaccines. In other words, some degree of social regulation and technology. In addition to Anthony Fauci, we also have capitalists like Bill Gates who are in that wing. Then there are the different public organizations themselves, foremost among them being the World Health Organization. There are also public agencies, such as One Health, which is a wing of the CDC here, and also NGOs like the Eco Health Alliance. And Wallace shows that all of these are directly tied in with the corporations that are responsible for this crisis in the first place, such as Colgate-Palmolive and Cargill. Now, there's a lot more to discuss, including the more wild conspiracy theories, and some of which are gaining a following of millions here in the U.S. And it's only through developing a thorough scientific understanding of COVID-19 that these theories can really be combated. However, I'd like to conclude with some points on program and perspectives. And there is no wing of the capitalist class that provides a solution. The reformist wing hides behind their reforms in order to continue to create the conditions that will create new zoonotic diseases. On the other hand, our class, the working class, is in ferment. We see that with the over 200 worker strikes and walkouts and protests. Of course, we have to support and help build those protests and help build those protests and the workers' movement in general. We have to raise a program that advances workers' power on the job and also in the community. And while we have to do that, we also have to explain that fighting for this is not enough. That capitalism is creating the conditions for new and even more devastating zoonotic diseases. And we have to explain what those conditions are: factory farming and habitat destruction. Failing to do that means dealing only with the symptoms but not the disease. It means dealing with the effects only but not the cause. Now, I think that there are a lot of related issues that we also have to find a way to raise. And one is the alternative to factory farming, which is regenerative farming. And I don't have time to go into that here, but if you look on my blog site, oaklandsocialist.com, you will find several articles on that issue. Now, also, I think part of our program should be for linking up the urban working class, maybe especially the urban working class youth, with rural workers and small farmers, and also for direct links between workers throughout the world and for direct links between agricultural workers and small farmers throughout the world. Another specific detail, at least for here in the U.S., is to call for an end to the farm bills, which come up every few years. These are multi-billion-dollar subsidies to agribusiness, factory farming, and to the fake urban millionaires who pose as farmers. And of course we can't raise this at every event, but we should keep it in the back of our minds. Now, all of this aims at the dire necessity for the working class to play an independent role, starting with the building of a mass working class party. Such a party will be born in struggle, in a struggle that will develop out of an effort to coordinate and further that struggle of millions of workers themselves. Comrades, this is not the first zoonotic disease to threaten us, nor will it be the last. I mentioned Nipah virus. Fortunately, it is not so easily transmitted, but according to the World Health Organization, its mortality rate is between 40 and 75%. It is in the evolutionary interest of every single pathogen to evolve in such a way as to become more easily transmitted. And capitalism has set the stage for such evolution, to be not only easier, but even to put pressure on the viruses to do so. Rob Wallace wrote, quote, Hendra, Ebola, malaria, SARS, SCRTB, Q fever, simian foamy virus, Nipah, and influenza. One of these bugs, or an as yet undiscovered cousin, will likely kill a few 100 million of us someday soon. It isn't if, as many scientists repeat, it's when. I opened with a comment on the column of Thomas Friedman. The problem with his comment is that while he is dimly aware of where he and his class are heading us all for, they're like an engineer on a runaway freight train. They are incapable of reversing course. But alongside this disastrous pandemic comes an opportunity. The viewpoint of the capitalist class is that humans live outside of and apart from the natural world. Nature is there simply to be dominated and exploited at will, just as our labor power is there for the same purpose. That is the meaning of the World Bank calling the wild savannas of Africa and Asia underused agricultural land. Now, this pandemic is reminding us that we are not separated from the natural world. This is starting to force workers to look at the natural world in an entirely new way. And we, as socialists and Marxists, must take advantage of that opportunity to encourage that different worldview. And first and foremost, in order to do that, we must do that ourselves by leading the way in changing how we ourselves look at this planet which we inhabit. Thank you for listening, and if you found this interesting, I urge you to take a look at my blog site, oaklandsocialist.com, and you can contact me at oaklandsocialist@gmail.com. Thank you.